Hi again, this is basically now part 2 of chapter 8, chapter 8 part 2 video, but we just start with the part 1. I explained the structure of the textbook and what has been covered so far and what is going to be next. In chapter 8 we have these learning objectives. So as I just mentioned in the part 1 video, we are explaining the basic Keynesian model. And in basic Keynesian model, it starts with the Keynesian theory of consumption. So out of all the variables which are explained, so let's quickly redraw our simplified model. So we will have the players of the game. We are going to have only 2 players, and basically I will make a copy of this here also, and then I will move it. So this is a simplified model. And how many markets we have? We have 2 markets. So again, let me change the color to green. These are my conventions. It's nothing special about it. And we assume that the other markets are actually in the state of equilibrium, and we are wondering how they. So these are our players, and of course the GDP. So this is, let me write it inside, this is the firms, this is the households. So 2 players, and private sector only economy with only private sectors. We have producers and consumers. These are producers, these are consumers. And the flow would be this is goods and services market, these are the money market, and these are other input, mainly labor market. I would write labor market. Okay. One assumption is that we assume money and labor market are in equilibrium. And or the variables, this is ceteris paribus, right? Ceteris paribus. So ceteris paribus means that all other macro variables, macro vars, are given. This given thing is also called exogenous. So it's been already determined from outside the model. So the wage, the interest rate, the money demand, money supply, etc., etc., they're all constant, fixed, constant. And the flow variables is coming the GDP here, and then it becomes the income to these people, and these people are paid like this. And then spending, these are deciding to either consume or to save. And we know that Actually, I should use a different color, but that's okay. I will then use the red also here. This is investment, and the investment will go from there to here. This is the simplified model. So model number 1. Chapter 8 is model A. I call it model A. No harm in that. So the circular flow diagram is much simpler and looks like this. There is no tax, there is no government spending, there's no import, there's no export. Okay, so aggregate expenditure of this economy, the total spending is either spent by the household or spent by the firms. Together, aggregate expenditure is going to be equal C plus I. And these are the arrows in, and in the equilibrium, this is going to be equal to the Y. And the Y aggregate output is going to become aggregate income, and aggregate income is paid to the families entirely. So there's no disposable income, and the national income are going to be almost the same. And the saving, so disposable income, this is disposable income, and then we have either consumption or saving. Okay, so this is the procedure that we are wondering how this can explain the behavior. So we are wondering what would be the way that we could explain the consumption function, that C variable. That C variable can be explained. So we are Keynes started with explaining the behavioral function of the consumption. This is called Keynesian theory of consumption. And also he explains the behavioral function of the investment, how the investment is changing. Because in this model, you would see that we need to explain this and this to know how the equilibrium takes place. What would be the major factors that affects the consumption? What would be the major factors that affect the investment? Something like this. Okay. Here we are bringing the interest rate. Actually, in the former editions of the textbook, this was not given. We were starting from a fixed amount, given amount of I, but there's no harm of saying that what would be the relationship between the investment and consumption with the interest rate, which interest rate is going to be determined in the money market. We could say that if the main assumption was that money market is in equilibrium, if equilibrium, then interest rate is constant. Then interest rate is constant. But we are open the bracket and say that what if interest rate is changing? Then how the investment, for example, would be affected. So this is also extra explanation of the planned investment and its relation with the interest rate, because interest rate is the most important factor. If in this market the equilibrium is going to determine the price of money, which is called interest, and the magnitude of money demand equal money supply. So this equilibrium interest rate, if it's higher, the families are responding differently. It means that if they lend their money, they can get more interest. And this for the firms is doing a quite opposite one. If the interest rate goes up, the investment, it means the borrowing from the others become more expensive. Cost of borrowing is increasing. So that is what the book is trying to explain in the learning objective 3, the relationship between planned investment and the interest rate. And then it moves to explaining how the level of output or income is going to be determined in goods and services market. So the determination of equilibrium output or the GDP which the country is producing, how it's determined endogenously or through the model, how the model explains its determination. And through this process, we are introducing a new concept called the multiplier. So the variables we are classifying the vars variables into endogenous, such as the GDP, level of GDP, and exogenous, those which are considered as given, is ceteris paribus. Maybe in the long run they are also changing. For example, interest rate, for example, money supply, for example, level of investment perhaps, etc., etc. All the other factors which are given. So if one of these which we assume is given is now it's changing, we could say that how it affects the equilibrium. And that analysis is basically changes in the y as a result of a changes of an exogenous variable. This is called the multiplier. I jumped to explain that premature, but if you be patient, we're going to describe the multiplier process of how a change in an exogenous variable may cause a change in the equilibrium level of output or income. And there is an appendix which I would highly recommend you to study the appendix as well. And the way that I explained already, the appendix is covered. So the variable which we are trying to basically explain its changes is number one, aggregate output, and aggregate output or real GDP is going to be equal to aggregate income or national income, we call it, because there is no rest of the world, there is no government. These two, what is being produced and sold into the goods and services market, is going to be what is being paid to factors of production, and it's going to become an income to the families. So that's a stage number one of understanding the first law of thermodynamics, that the aggregate output and aggregate income are equal. What the arrows goes in, the arrows comes out. So there is this notion. In any given period, there is an exact equality between the aggregate output, the production, and aggregate income, the payments to factors of production. You should be reminded of this fact whenever you encounter to combine the term aggregate output in the bracket income. So income and output are considered, but the expenditure, aggregate expenditure, is the total sum of these. So the only disequilibrium may be envisaged is that equilibrium is the aggregate output income is equal the aggregate expenditure, but it is possible that the aggregate output is bigger than aggregate expenditure, or the aggregate output is smaller than the aggregate expenditure. So we would explain that how this equilibrium may take place. Ultimately, this is gonna happen. But if initially we start from a stage which the spending is larger than the output, then there is a self mechanism which brings the economy back to the It's like that model we had, surplus or deficit. Everything else remains the same. This surplus would lead to equilibrium, and this deficit will lead to equilibrium if everything else remains the same. And similar analogy would be about the aggregate. Is aggregate output income is equal to the aggregate expenditure or not? And then the analogy will bring us to the equilibrium. So that's the, in a nutshell, what this model is all about. And the endogenous variable is that y variable. The y variable, we show it with the y variable. A combined term, the y is reminded as exactly between aggregate output and aggregate income. And make no mistakes that this is the real GDP in real term. We are not basically assuming that the price level is increase or decrease, so we have inflation or deflation. As I told you before, we are assuming that the everything else remains the same. So what we assume that P or CPI is constant. So that is a presumptions. At this stage it is fixed, and interest rate, the book is playing with it because it's considered as an exogenous variable. We could also consider the P as an exogenous variable, but we will do it in chapter 11. In chapter 11 we come back to the price. But at this stage we are assuming that inflation or deflation is not an issue, and hence the GDP we are talking about is fixed price. So it is real GDP, real term. So what is this model known as the basic Keynesian model? Keynes' classic book is called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, Money, and he published his book in 1936, as I said it before, 1936. And in this model, he tried to explain how the consumption is behaving, the consumption function. So we are saying the consumption is a function of something. So what are those things which may affect? I basically copied and pasted from the book, and it is page 96 of the book, page 96. And I read it through this paragraph, and this is explaining the core theory behind the consumption function. Or perhaps I should make it, if I can do it, I am not sure. Can I choose, oops, undo? If I can make this copy, okay, copy, and bring it here so as I can write it in the whiteboard. I'm afraid it's not working. I apologize for my poor performance. I did it before, it worked, but now it's not working. Anyway, I will read it through. From an examination of the above objective factors which determine the propensity to consume, I'm going to explain what he means by the propensity to consume. Keynes is in his book in page 96 is mentioning the fundamental psychological law upon which we are entitled to depend with great confidence, both a priori from our knowledge of human nature and from the detailed facts of experience is that men are disposed as a rule and on average to increase consumption as their income increase, but not by as much as the increase in their income. What that means? So he's trying to say that consumption is a function of income. We could say the disposable income actually. Disposable income. But because in our simple model there is no tax, so y minus t is the disposable income. Because this is, we assumed, is negligible or zero, so here we are talking about the income. So he's suggesting that if I draw the consumption, if I put the disposable income here and the consumption here as the dependent variable, as this is increasing, surely based on the psychology of human nature, this is going to increase. So it's a positively slope. But if you take dc over dy, this is going to be smaller than 1. It means that if it changes by, let's say, 100 units, if the denominator is increasing by 100 units, the consumption is going to increase, but not with the same pace. It's going to be smaller than 100, let's say 70 units. So the slope is going to be like this, something like this. So the slope, the changes in the C as a result of the changes in the disposable income, the delta C over delta YD is smaller than 1 but is bigger than 0. So hence the marginal propensity to consume is positive but less than the unity. So this thing, the changes of the consumption as a result of a change in the disposable income, is called marginal propensity to consume. For the sake of simplicity, because this is curvature, we can assume that this functional form can be written as a linear relationship. So C is A plus B YD. Okay, so this B is the slope, and the slope delta C over delta YD, we call it marginal propensity to consume. And this intercept A, okay, is called autonomous consumption. There's a reason for calling it autonomous consumption, because it means that if we give the value 0 to this, the consumption is going to be equal to this. So at level of income 0, how much people are consuming? And this, according to Keynes, is always bigger than 0. There is a positive intercept, y-intercept. Positive always positive, or just let me write the sign, positive y-intercept. So the theory of consumption according to Keynes is that let's collect the data for consumption and test this theory. You should get this always positive and this positive, but B falls between 0 and 1. It cannot be bigger than 1. or not even equal to 1. It cannot be bigger than, it's this inequality is testable. And this also, the whether this is positive or negative, it is testable against the data. And so the consumption theory of Keynesian consumption theory is the best way to explain how in this model this may change as the income change. So this change as the income change, and then it can come and determine the equilibrium in the economy. So theorizing is a hypothesis. So this is a hypothesis, and then we formulate it in mathematical relationship or functions, consumption function, and then we put it into explain how the GDP may be determined within the economy. So consumption function, if it is linear function, as I just said, it is starting from a positive intercept and a positive slope which is less than 1. Positive slope which is less than 1. So the positive slope is called, so that's exactly the way that we can write it, C plus A, if we assume it is linear function. If we for the sake of simplicity, by the way, the slope is representing the marginal propensity to consume, and we are testing this idea that whether this is less than 1. It is positive and less than 1, and it appears that this test has been done over and over, and we have come up exactly with the same conclusion that yes, marginal propensity to consume is positive and less than 1. So that's the definition of the marginal propensity to consume, a fraction of a change in income that is consumed or spent. So we are not going to spend the entire increase in our income. We are going to spend a fraction of that. That fraction is called marginal propensity to consume, or slope of the consumption function. Another thing is that if you know the consumption function, so a consumption function it can be something like this. Can it be consumption function plus 100 plus 0.8 y? Consumption minus 20 plus 0.8 y. Consumption minus 80 minus 0.2 y. So this is A, B, C, D. I write another one. C is equal 100 minus 0.5 y. The question is that which one of these can be the consumption function? So immediately you would say that the only candidate can be this one, because MPC is I could actually write another one. E C is equal 100 plus 1.2 y. Which one of these is representing the consumption function? The only candidate could be this, because the intercept, y-intercept, or the autonomous consumption should be positive. So this might be true, these two might be true. And the marginal propensity to consume, MPC, or the slope, must be positive but less than 1. And this is positive, but it is bigger than 1, so this is wrong. This is negative, this is wrong. This is negative, wrong. This is positive and less than 1, so this is okay, but this is not okay. So this is also not good. So the only candidate could be this function. So if we have a consumption in general mean, C is equal A plus B Y. Can we say that what would be our saving function? The answer is yes, because we know from our laws that Y is always equal either consumption or the save. So if you know the function of this, you can determine the function of Y based on the same independent variable. So independent variable is here is Y. Y can change without we decide. So if this is that, so we would put it Y equal either consumed or saved. So the saving is gonna be Y minus C. So Y minus, what is the C? A minus B Y. So then you will sort it out. It becomes minus A plus 1 minus B Y. And this is interesting because the intercept, because A is always positive, the intercept, the y-intercept of S is always negative. And this part is called autonomous saving. Autonomous saving. Autonomous saving is always negative. And the slope of this function, delta S over delta Y, this is also bigger than 0 and smaller than 1. Because if this is like 0.8, 1 minus 0.8 becomes 0.2. It's always falling between this inequality condition. Inequality condition. So we call this one 1 minus B or 1 minus MPC as marginal propensity to save. Marginal propensity to save. We can determine this equation from this also. Y is always equal, because this is an identity, consumption plus the saving. Because that's how the circular flow diagram says. The money we get, either we spend buying goods and services or we are lending to others by putting into the banking system, to the money market. If so, it's not difficult to write that delta Y is equal delta C plus delta S. And let's divide both sides by delta Y again. Okay, so this is 1. And what is this? We named it marginal propensity to consume. And this one, we called it the slope of the saving function, marginal propensity to save. And this is always equal to 1. So make sure that you know this identity. There are some models which this may not be equal to 1, but this is a complicated model which in intermediate macroeconomics. So the basic Keynesian model, it's assumed that the total sum of marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save adds up to 1. So it's always something like this. So the saving function, we can determine the identity, as I said, triple line. And you know that, let me, in a bracket, I explain the difference between identity and equation. When I say that the C is equal A plus Y, BY, this is an equation. So you have to give this, and I determine this. But the identity is like the first law of thermodynamics, always true. Always Y is either consumed or saved. Okay, so this is always true, irrespective of the numbers. And let me basically give an examples of equations. x minus 5 equals 0. So what is x? For only some values, this is true. For only some values, this is true. So x, if it is equal 5, this is true. Any other value of x, it's become unequal. So equation for some values, of variable, it is true. For the identity, this is an identity. A plus b square is a square plus 2ab plus b square. And we are using the 3 line here. No matter what number you give to a and b, no matter what you give, it is always like this. So this is what we call it, identity. For all values of variable or parameters a and b, it is true like this. So when we say that it is an identity, it means that irrespective of what you give, it is come true. And that is the case of the identity here. Something that always true by definition. The problem with the identity is that it's not explaining the change then. But the equations, if you change a little bit of income, then it moves from equity to unequity, from equilibrium to disequilibrium. That's the beauty of the function or equation, which explains the second law of thermodynamics or behavioral aspects of variables. Okay, so I already explained this slide. And this is a consumption function. We have 3 ways of explaining. Number one is with equation. Number 2 is with graph. And number 3 with table or schedule. So sometimes in exam, we give the table and we ask you a question. Sometimes we give the equation like this, and sometimes we just draw the diagram and we will put some unknown things inside the graph. And all these three ways are just different representation of the consumption, theory of consumption, Keynesian consumption. Okay, so now we see in this diagram that if you have the consumption function, you can determine the saving function and vice versa, because they are always equal. So if we have 0 income and the consumption is 100, how much would be the autonomous saving? Autonomous saving would be 0 minus 100 equal minus 100. This comes from this identity. Actually, this is an identity. This is an identity. So you can see the relationship between these two. At certain level of income, this 45-degree line is showing, if I put the Y here and consumption here, the 45-degree line shows that the Y is equal C. Okay? Y is equal C. And the consumption is not always equal to the because we already said that consumption is it's written here. Consumption is equal 100 plus 0.75 Y. So Y and C can only be equal if the level of income is 400. You put 400 here, and this plus 100, this is giving you 400, exactly 400. So this 400 multiplied by 0.75 become 300. 300 plus 100 is 400. So C and Y are going to be equal at this level of income. At any income level bigger than that, income is going to be bigger than the consumption. And at any level below that, like 200, income is going to be less than the consumption, like the zero also. The income is 0, but the consumption is positive 100. At 200, the consumption, the income is 200. So this is 200, 45-degree line, 200. But how much people are spending on consuming expenditure? They're spending 250. So 250 is bigger than this. As long as the income is less than that 400, always there is this gap is showing de-saving. It means that people have to borrow to do that consumption. But if they're at higher level of income, this is called the saving. And the saving is been shown here basically. You see? Saving, de-saving. So this is the axis. And here is negative, there is positive. So positive saving, negative saving. This has been showing the relationship between the income and consumption and saving function. There is a mutual relationship between them. Everything else remains the same, by the way. Are there any other functions, other factors which affects the consumption? Of course, yes, because like in demand and supply function also we said consumption is a function of disposable income and other factors. Other factors can be wealth, can be expectation, can be interest, and etc. The reason that I put these ones, wealth, if you become rich, suddenly your consumption is increasing. Expectation, if you think that tomorrow is a very things are going to go bad, so you will preserve to not spending too much on to somewhat secure yourself about the bad situation in the future. But if you think that your income is going to increase in the future and you're going to get a better job, then you start picking up your consumption increasing. So that's the expectation will affect the consumption. And the interest rate, why I said interest rate, because in the circular flow diagram, we know that the saving is in the money market. If the interest rate goes up, the people are expecting to get more reward for their lending. So by saving, actually they lend their money to others. So if the interest rate goes up, saving will go up, hence the consumption will come down, because at given level of output, if saving goes up, then the consumption should go down. So consumption is negatively affected by interest rate, something like that. So these are other factors which affect the consumption function. So let me pause it here, and then I will explain the behavior of the investment, and then we will determine the equilibrium in goods and services market. Thank you.